For a new series on this channel, we will be looking at some of the most disturbing illnesses that have ravaged the human race throughout its history. We will be starting with syphilis, a disease that became associated with the unclean, the deviant, and the morally bankrupt. Syphilis causes sores, rashes, and fevers in the early stages, but by the final stage, it can result in tumor-like growths, damage to the nervous system, and even death. In today's video, we will explore the history of syphilis, its impact, and some of the disturbing experiments involving syphilis. Syphilis is a bacterial disease caused by the Treponema pallidum organism. It is largely contracted through unprotected intercourse, though it can be passed from mother to child in the utero, resulting in the child being born with congenital syphilis. It is often called the Great Imitator, as many of the symptoms can be dismissed as other illnesses. These include fever, rashes, or swollen glands. At first, the disease will present itself with lesions on a person's genitals. This may be all the person experiences. However, without treatment, the disease may progress with skin growths akin to venereal warts and flu-like symptoms. Whilst these symptoms may pass within a few weeks, they may come and go over months before they fade. Even if the symptoms fade, the person will still be infected. This is known as latent syphilis, and it can persist for decades and lead to serious problems if not treated, and is potentially life-threatening. People with this final stage of syphilis may experience meningitis, strokes, and even dementia-like symptoms. There are two main schools of thought as to where syphilis originated: Colombian and Pre-Columbian hypotheses. The Colombian hypothesis states that in addition to bringing back the wealth of the Americas, Columbus and his voyagers brought back with them syphilis. It was only 3 years after Columbus's first voyage that a major outbreak of syphilis struck soldiers during the Italian War of 1494. The French army and its Spanish mercenary auxiliaries captured the city of Naples and soon found themselves afflicted. As the soldiers returned home, they brought with them and spread the disease all over Europe. The Pre-Columbian hypothesis states that syphilis was already in Europe and indeed the rest of the world, and that syphilis may have just been misdiagnosed as leprosy. The mutation of syphilis could have been possible due to the increase in large towns, populations, and low levels of sanitation. For both of these theories, there is evidence in the form of skeletons bearing evidence of syphilis in both the Dominican Republic and in Austria, dated well before the voyages of Columbus. Wherever the disease may have come from, what cannot be denied is how fast it was able to spread using the many trade routes that exploded it into being. Sailors would carry the disease around the world, passing the disease to whomever they would have had unprotected intercourse with. Often, this would be women who worked in brothels. Early reports of the disease describe those who were affected dying within months, perhaps indicating a much more lethal strain that exists today. Early attempts to treat the disease included mercury, either by ingestion, as a rub on the skin, or as a vapor. It soon became standard naming practice that a nation would call syphilis after their long-time rival or enemy. For example, the English called it the French disease, the Turks called it the Christian disease, and the Russians called it the Polish disease. Due to the way it spread, syphilis was soon linked with poor morals and seen as a divine punishment. Those who were infected were shunned. Whilst the disease would affect people from every social class and social standing, it particularly affected the poor. Women who worked as prostitutes or in the domestic services were often at high risk of being infected. Its link to promiscuity and prostitution made syphilis not only something to fear as a potential consequence, but also developed into a taboo against sex itself. It's important to note that every class was affected by syphilis, despite the push to label this a disease of the poor. Some of history's most famous individuals are believed to or actually had contracted syphilis, notably Al Capone, Leo Tolstoy, and Archduke Otto of Austria, brother to Franz Ferdinand, whose death sparked World War I. Much work was also done in repairing the damage done to a person afflicted by syphilis. It was common that the afflicted nose would fall off, and so a market for artificial noses emerged. So too did attempts to surgically reconstruct nose defects, with doctors such as Gasparo Tagliacozzi establishing the fundamentals of reconstructive surgery. The first breakthrough cure for syphilis was discovered by Soichiro Hata in 1909. By 1943, and the discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming meant the world had access to a reliable cure. Nevertheless, there have been throughout human history instances of unscrupulous doctors and governments using unwilling patients to develop a better understanding of the disease. During Imperial Japan's occupation of mainland China, an infamous biological weapons testing group was established, known as Unit 731. In one of their experiments, prisoners were forced to infect one another with syphilis, with women forcibly impregnated. The studies involved observations as to how the disease developed and how it affected an unborn fetus. We do have a video on Unit 731 for those who wish to learn more about it, as this single experiment is but scratching the surface. Another horrendous experiment is the Tuskegee syphilis study. The study began in 1932 and ran until 1972, only stopping when the story broke in the media. The study involved hundreds of black men with syphilis who were mainly poor and came from farming backgrounds. They were promised medical treatment as well as to look into the vague illness, bad blood. The goal of the experiment was to understand the effects of syphilis if left untreated, particularly on African American men, as the illness was thought to devastate their respiratory system. The men in the study were never at any point told of their syphilis diagnosis and were blind to the true nature of the experiment. As stated previously, penicillin was discovered in 1943, and by late 1940s, it had become standard treatment. The men were never given any meaningful treatment, and instead were given placebos and were told they were suffering from another illness. As a result, many of the men went on to infect their partners, with 19 children also being born with congenital syphilis. Despite the cure being openly available, no such treatment was given, and 100 of the men died from a very preventable illness. Anti-poor and racist beliefs pushed the notion that these groups of people were susceptible to syphilis were the key drivers in its spread, and that they simply did not care enough about the illness to seek treatment. What's more, following the Second World War, the United States was instrumental in forming the Nuremberg Code. This code was supposed to provide protection for research subjects, yet the experiment was able to continue for just under 3 decades, in a very clear breach of this code. As a result of this experiment, many people, in particular the African American community to this day, do not trust the government in respect of public health. While syphilis has been brought under a level of control, it is a disease that still claims the lives of around 100,000 people each year. Syphilis retains its stigma as one of the nastiest venereal diseases. Whilst its potency is not what it once was, it is a disease that cannot be ignored. Syphilis is a story of stigmatization, where it would be given the name of the nation's most hated enemy, and then blamed on the poor and other marginalized groups. However, it is not through such acts that diseases can be beaten and controlled, but through understanding and eliminating factors that allow it to spread.